Welcome to the Daily Deep Dive, the 3D initiative of UPSC with Sarab Karshik. I'm really glad you're joining us today because, honestly, today's Current Affairs Digest is heavy. It is Thursday, June 4, 2026, and the overarching theme we keep seeing everywhere is just, well, it's systems under massive stress,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And it's that desperate search for stability in the middle of it all.
Exactly. Like, normally when we look at these macroscopic systems that run our world, national power grids, global supply chains, legal frameworks, we just kind of subconsciously expect them to be resilient.
Right. You look at a suspension bridge and you see these mathless steel cables. You don't think about the math. You just assume it can hold the weight.
Right. You just assume it works.
Because the alternative is just, it's exhausting. If we constantly thought about how fragile the systems keeping us alive really are, we'd go crazy.
You really would. But the reality of today's news is that it strips away that illusion entirely. Because when you actually look closely at that steel cable, you see all these microscopic stress fractures buried inside it.
Yeah. And the bridge doesn't just collapse on a random sunny Tuesday. It snaps when a very specific, unexpected gust of wind hits the exact resonant frequency of those weak points.
That's a perfect way to put it. And if you look at the primary sources we're diving into today, from local municipal failures in Delhi all the way up to macroeconomic policy at the RBI and geopolitical war rooms in Washington and Tehran, every single data point is screaming the same thing.
Everything is under acute, unprecedented stress.
Yeah. We're looking at a domestic and global landscape that is just fracturing. So we're going to preview the journey today. We'll start with local governance failures in Delhi, move to the massive digital undertaking of the 2027 census, and then talk about the legal battle over your digital footprint.
And then we have to zoom way out, right, to the global geopolitical shocks in the Middle East.
Oh, absolutely. How those shocks trigger economic shockwaves at the RBI and in international trade. And finally, we're going to close with a truly groundbreaking win in medical science, because we need some good news today.
We definitely do.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the first major systemic fracture we have to talk about is a devastatingly human one. We need to look at what happened yesterday, June 3, in the Malviya Nagar neighborhood of South Delhi.
Yeah. The tragedy at the Flourish Stay Bed and Breakfast.
It's just horrific. It is a brutal example of what happens when the municipal regulations that are supposed to protect vulnerable people just completely evaporate.
It really is. It's not just a localized fire incident, right? It's the lethal culmination of a very specific regulatory loophole. And it intersects directly with the booming economics of India's medical tourism sector.
Right. Let's establish the baseline facts first. Yesterday morning, a massive fire engulfed the Flourish Stay B&B. It's a classic mixed-use commercial building. You've got the Lemon Green restaurant on the ground floor and the B&B on the 3 floors above it.
A very common setup in that area.
Extremely common. But the human toll here is staggering. We are looking at 21 confirmed fatalities.
It's awful.
And what turns this from a terrible local tragedy into a massive international diplomatic incident is who those victims were. Preliminary reports say 17 or 18 of the 21 deceased are foreign nationals.
Yeah, citizens from Bangladesh, Nigeria, Mozambique, Liberia, and some Central Asian republics.
Which is such a specific demographic concentration. Why were they all clustered in this one budget B&B in South Delhi?
Well, that's the crucial analytical pivot here. To understand that, you have to look at the macroeconomics of the Indian medical tourism industry. It's a massive sector. We're talking 40,000 to 50,000 crore rupees.
Wow. I knew it was big, but that's massive.
Right. And India has deliberately positioned itself as the main hub for affordable, world-class specialized care for the global south.
So patients from sub-Saharan Africa or Central Asia are flying into Delhi for complex procedures.
Exactly. Oncology treatments, cardiac bypasses, organ transplants. They can get this done at premier institutes like AIMS or Safdarjung for a fraction of what it costs in Europe or North America.
Right, but the surgery itself is only part of the cost.
Exactly. The medical procedure is just a fraction of the total journey. These patients and their caregivers need accommodation for weeks, sometimes months, for pre-op assessments and post-op recovery.
And by the time they pay for flights, visas, and the surgery, their money is basically gone.
Yes, they can't afford highly regulated 5-star corporate hotels, so they optimize entirely for cost and proximity to the hospital.
Which creates this massive shadow economy of cheap accommodations around the major medical centers. Places like Malvia Nagar and Green Park become ground zero for this.
Yeah, high-density, low-cost hospitality.
It's like building a state-of-the-art, world-class operating room, but the hallway leading to it is made of dry kindling.
That's a grim analogy, but it's entirely accurate. The medical care inside the hospital is world-class. But the ecosystem surrounding it, the environment where these highly vulnerable, physically compromised patients are living, it's basically an unregulated death trap.
So where does the legal architecture fail? Like, how is this allowed to happen?
It's in how the state classifies a hotel versus a bed and breakfast. A commercial hotel faces a punishing labyrinth of municipal approvals. The National Building Code, the NBC 2016, dictates that commercial hotels must have a stringent fire safety certificate.
Meaning sprinklers, fire exits, all that.
Exactly. Commercial-grade automated sprinklers, pressurized stairwells to keep smoke out, dedicated external fire exits, trained fire wardens on site.
But retrofitting an old South Delhi building with pressurized stairwells would destroy the profit margin for a budget operator, right?
100%. So they look for the loophole, and the loophole is the B&B license.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the Ministry of Tourism originally created the bed and breakfast scheme to encourage grassroots tourism, like a family renting out a spare bedroom to a backpacker.
Right, so because it's viewed as a residential dwelling, the regulations are way lighter.
Precisely. B&Bs are largely exempt for those heavy, expensive fire safety mandates of the NBC 2016.
So an operator can lease a 4-story commercial building, pack it with recovering surgical patients, but legally register it as a series of distinct bed and breakfasts to bypass the fire codes.
Yes, they get the commercial revenue, but zero commercial compliance. The Republic World investigation into this specific fire highlights exactly that. Flourish Day was operating as a high-density medical hotel, but it had no automated sprinklers, no secondary emergency exit, and no integrated smoke detection system linked to the fire brigade.
And then you add the mixed-use hazard, the Lemon Green restaurant on the ground floor.
Right. You have a commercial kitchen operating directly beneath sleeping patients, industrial refrigerators, massive unmonitored commercial gas cylinders, open flame cooking.
It's a perfect storm. The preliminary forensic reports suggest an electrical short circuit in that ground floor restaurant, and the physics of a fire in that specific layout are just terrifying.
Yeah, when a fire ignites on the ground floor of a building with only one central staircase, that staircase immediately becomes a thermal chimney.
Because the hot gases and toxic smoke rise, drawing in fresh oxygen from the shattered windows downstairs, and it just accelerates.
Exactly. Within 3 minutes, the only escape route for the upper floors is completely compromised by superheated smoke.
And remember, these aren't able-bodied backpackers. These are medical tourists recovering from major surgeries. People on crutches or using oxygen.
Right. When that staircase fills with smoke, they are physically incapable of navigating it. That's why the footage yesterday was so horrific. Desperate people, a mother with a young child, forced to jump from third-story windows onto mattresses, dragged out by local shopkeepers.
It's an absolute systemic failure. But who is ultimately accountable? I mean, the National Building Code 2016 exists. It has all the standards for fire-resistant materials and emergency lighting. Why isn't it enforced in Malvia Nagar?
Because of the constitutional architecture of India. The NBC is published by the Bureau of Indian Standards, a central government entity. But under Schedule 7 of the Indian Constitution, fire services and urban planning are exclusively state subjects.
Ah, so the central government can publish the best code in the world, but it's just a guideline.
Exactly. It has no statutory authority until a state legislature or an urban local body, like the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, formally adopts it into their local bylaws and actually allocates resources to enforce it.
And that's the enforcement vacuum. Municipal bodies are underfunded, understaffed, and often plagued by local corruption. The inspectors just don't have the bandwidth to audit every mixed-use building.
And even when they do, the political economy of local real estate often means violations are ignored for a price. The institutional capacities are broken. The 19th Law Commission recommended a centralized National Fire Services Act back in 2010 to standardize this.
And that was 16 years ago. It's just languished.
Yep.
Well, the policy implications are massive. If India wants to keep its soft power and the revenue from being the medical ward of the developing world, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Tourism cannot operate in silos anymore.
No, they can't. If an Indian hospital sponsors a medical visa, there has to be a mandate that the accommodation they use has a specialized, rigorously audited medical tourism safety certificate, completely separate from the B&B license.
Right. Mandatory sprinklers in all commercial residential mixed-use structures above 2 stories,
Yeah.
period. Fire doesn't care about zoning classifications.
Exactly.
Okay, transitioning from the failure of local urban regulation to the failure of macro-level demographic categorization, we need to talk about a system that is currently buckling under its own technological ambitions.
You're talking about the 2027 census.
Yes. Because to solve structural issues like urban planning, governments need unimpeachable demographic data. But what happens when the multi-billion rupee apparatus designed to collect that data starts showing massive glitches?
It's escalating into a real crisis. Recent directives from the Registrar General of India, the RGI, show that the foundation of this whole digital enumeration exercise is cracking.
The reporting is genuinely alarming. The RGI has ordered a massive emergency recheck of the data already submitted during Phase 1, the House Listing and Housing Census, or the HLO phase.
Right, and they're seeing severe anomalies, specifically concentrated in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and some northeastern states.
And these aren't just minor clerical typos.
No, they strike at the very integrity of the data collection methodology.
Let's focus on the mechanical nature of these glitches, because it's a fascinating paradox. This is our first fully digital census. We have over 30 lakh enumerators armed with smartphones and a bespoke census mobile app.
Yeah.
We have a real-time census management and monitoring system, the CMMS portal. We even have a self-enumeration web portal for citizens. Shouldn't this technology make the data more accurate, not less?
You'd think so. But the technology isn't failing on its own. Human behavioral economics is actively subverting it. Well, when you introduce a rigid digital interface into a messy human environment, you inadvertently create new, highly efficient avenues for systemic corruption. Look at the demographic profile of those 30 lakh enumerators.
They're mostly school teachers, right?
Primary school teachers, local revenue clerks, Anganwadi workers. They're not professional statisticians. They've been pulled away from their regular exhausting jobs, handed a smartphone, and told to hit aggressive daily quotas in this sweltering summer heat.
So they're incentivized by speed. They just want to clear the queue.
Exactly. And the app, designed for efficiency, actually gives them the tools for mass falsification. Let's look at the anomalies the RGI flagged. The first is bulk entries, or template copying.
Oh, I see. In a paper census, forging 50 forms takes actual physical effort.
Right. But on the app, if an enumerator assumes an entire village block is socioeconomically identical, the software might let them populate a template saying every house is a concrete structure with grid electricity, and just rapidly copy-paste that template across dozens of entries in minutes.
But wait, doesn't the CMMS portal have geofencing and GPS tracking to prevent exactly that?
It does, and that's actually how the RGI caught the anomaly. The back-end algorithms track the GPS ping of the smartphone. The system flagged massive discrepancies where an enumerator submitted data for 40 households spread across a 2-kilometer radius, but their GPS coordinates showed they hadn't moved from a single spot for 3 hours.
Oh, wow. They were just sitting under a tree somewhere faking the data.
Exactly. The back-end monitoring caught the front-end subversion.
Okay, but what about the self-enumeration feature? That was supposed to be the ultimate efficiency hack, letting citizens do the data entry themselves.
That feature introduced a massive verification blind spot. Citizens can pre-fill their HLO data online. The protocol dictates that the enumerator must still physically visit the household, review a reference code, and visually verify the structural claims. Like, is the roof actually concrete or is it just tin?
Let me guess. The enumerators, wanting to save time, see a pre-filled flag on their app and just bypass the physical visit entirely.
You guessed it. They assume the self-reported data is accurate and just authorize it. But self-reported data in a welfare state is inherently unreliable.
Right, because people might misunderstand the technical definitions or deliberately alter their responses to look more economically disadvantaged to qualify for subsidies under schemes like PM Awas Yojana.
Precisely. Without independent physical verification, the entire data set becomes polluted with subjective bias.
And India simply cannot afford a polluted data set in 2027. The geopolitical and domestic political weight resting on this specific census is existentially high. It's way beyond a standard decadal update.
It's arguably the most consequential statistical exercise in the history of independent India. There are 3 massive political imperatives driving it.
Let's unpack the first one, the sheer data vacuum. The 2021 census was delayed indefinitely by COVID, so we are managing a rapidly evolving $4 trillion economy using demographic data from 2011.
A 16-year gap. The federal government is basically flying blind. Internal migration, urbanization, fertility rate, shifts every macroeconomic model and welfare targeting mechanism is based on an India that no longer exists.
The economic targeting is crucial, but it's the second imperative that makes this a political powder keg. The explicit inclusion of comprehensive granular caste enumeration.
This is the historical earthquake. For the first time since the 1931 census under the British Raj, the Indian state is attempting to comprehensively map the specific subcastes within the other backward classes, or OBC category.
Right. Since independence, the census has only enumerated scheduled castes and scheduled tribes for constitutional reservations. The OBC population, which is the vast majority, has never been officially counted by the central census.
Right, their population percentage has always been extrapolated from sample surveys. By injecting hard, empirical, digitized data regarding the exact size and status of every OBC subcaste into the public domain, the state is fundamentally rewriting the ledger of political power.
And that triggers the danger of strategic misclassification.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. When access to government jobs, education, and political power is directly tied to your caste's numerical strength, there is a massive incentive to manipulate the data. We're already seeing fears of dominant agricultural castes strategically registering under more backward classifications to capture larger quotas.
And if that schoolteacher enumerator is intimidated by local political bosses or just copying templates, the resulting data will trigger decades of explosive litigation.
It absolutely will.
Which brings us to the third imperative, and maybe the most constitutionally dangerous one: delimitation. The 2027 census is the legally mandated trigger for redrawing parliamentary constituencies and reapportioning Lok Sabha seats based on population.
And this is the looming crisis regarding the North-South divide. Through the 84th Amendment, the reapportionment of seats was frozen until the first census after 2026, specifically to protect southern states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka.
Because they successfully implemented population control measures, while northern states like UP and Bihar saw explosive population growth.
Exactly. So if new Lok Sabha seats are apportioned according to raw population data from this census, the South will be catastrophically penalized for actually following federal policy. They'll lose massive proportionate representation, while the North gains an insurmountable supermajority.
And layered on top of all of that is the 33% Women's Reservation Act, which can't be enacted until the delimitation process is finalized.
Right, which can't begin until the census data is published.
So the entire future architecture of Indian political representation rests entirely on the accuracy of data being entered by overwhelmed school teachers on glitchy mobile apps during a heat wave.
Yeah, it's no wonder the RGI is panicking and ordering rechecks. The margin for error is functionally zero.
Okay, let's invert this paradigm. We just talked about the state desperately trying to categorize you and pin you to a digital database. But what happens when the citizen wants to be erased from that permanent digital memory?
We are entering the profound philosophical battleground of the digital era, the right to be forgotten versus the public interest in historical transparency.
The catalyst for this discussion is a really fascinating legal maneuver. The Supreme Court of India, a bench led by Justice Kaul, just issued a stay order, freezing previous rulings from the Delhi High Court and Patiala House Court.
Right.
Those lower courts had granted a sweeping victory to a man who had been implicated in the Augusta-Westland helicopter procurement scam. He was legally discharged after the judicial process ran its course. And to be clear, we are not taking sides on his guilt or innocence.
No, absolutely not. We are strictly analyzing the competing constitutional frameworks here.
His argument makes a lot of intuitive sense. He's saying, the system processed me and discharged me. I'm cleared. Why should a Google search of my name eternally pull up archived court documents linking me to a massive corruption scandal?
Right. He petitioned the courts to force Indian Canoon, a massive, free digital repository of legal judgments, to permanently delete or de-index records containing his name. The lower courts agreed, prioritizing his right to move on.
But the Supreme Court stepped in and said, wait, we can't just start deleting the public record.
It's a phenomenal legal dilemma. On one side, you have the individual's right to privacy. The 2017 Puttaswamy case recognized privacy as an intrinsic part of the right to life under Article 21. It established informational privacy, the idea that you should have autonomy over how your personal data is disseminated.
I really want to defend the privacy angle here. Before the internet, if you were acquitted, the records existed, but they were buried in a dusty physical ledger in a basement. You had practical obscurity.
Yes, physical friction.
But today, search engines eradicate that friction. An accusation from 20 years ago is instantly accessible to every prospective employer or landlord. It feels like digital purgatory without the possibility of parole.
Your argument is exactly what birthed the right to be forgotten in the EU. The 2014 Google Spain decision ruled that search engines must remove links to personal info if it's inadequate or no longer relevant. This became the right to erasure in the GDPR.
And India's new DPDP Act of 2023, specifically Section 13, grants individuals the right to demand erasure of their personal data from fiduciaries once the purpose for collecting it is fulfilled. So this guy seems to have strong legal backing. Why is the Supreme Court hesitating?
Because fundamental rights are inherently competitive. The right to privacy has to be balanced against the public's right to know, which derives from freedom of speech and expression under Article 19. Justice Call is pointing out the catastrophic danger of weaponizing this right against the architecture of the state itself.
I see the danger. De-indexing a revenge porn site is one thing. Forcing Indian Canoon to alter a legally binding judicial decree is different. It's like letting someone burn history books in a public library just because the history reflects poorly on them.
Exactly. And Justice Call outlined rigorous stress tests for this. First, the preservation of historical, journalistic, and legal transparency. Court records are public documents. They're how citizens monitor the justice system.
Right. If we let people retroactively scrub their names, we create black holes in our legal history. How do law students or journalists research precedents?
They can't. The second test evaluates the individual making the claim. Is the person a public figure? Public figures inherently possess a significantly lower expectation of privacy regarding their professional conduct.
And the third test is the ongoing relevance to the public interest. So the court is drawing a line between a juvenile offender seeking a fresh start for a minor theft and a high-level official implicated in a national defense procurement scam.
Yes. The public has a vested interest in knowing the history of the latter, even if they were discharged. The Supreme Court is signaling that while informational privacy is legitimate, it cannot override judicial accountability.
The delete button can't be handed over to those who want to rewrite history. It's a profound tension. But while we debate control over our digital past, we are being brutally reminded of the limits of our control over the physical present. We've spent the first half of this deep dive on domestic systems. Now we have to look at how international systems breaking down directly hit the Indian economy. Let's pivot to the Middle East.
The kinetic reality in West Asia has crossed from a regional conflict into a systemic threat to global macroeconomic stability, and India's exposure is absolute.
The June 4 Digest reads like a prelude to a global energy crisis. The U.S.-Israel military campaign against Iran, Operation Roaring Lion, has triggered Iran's retaliation, Operation True Promise IV, and yesterday, June 3, Iranian drones struck Kuwait International Airport.
And tragically, the one confirmed fatality was an Indian national.
It's devastating. It shatters the illusion that India is insulated from this war. Simultaneously, the IRGC targeted the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, and the U.S. responded by striking an Iranian drone control station on Qeshm Island.
Qeshm Island is the geographic center of gravity for this phase of the conflict. It sits right in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz.
The strait is incredibly narrow, right? Like 21 miles wide.
Yes, and it's the most critical energy jugular vein on the planet. Roughly 20% of the world's daily crude oil and nearly 25% of the global LNG supply transits through that channel.
And Iran has militarized Qeshm Island with anti-ship missiles and drones. The U.S. strike was trying to degrade Iran's ability to coordinate attacks on shipping because Iran has effectively blockaded the Strait of Hormuz against Western-aligned shipping. The strait is functionally closed.
And that is the ultimate nightmare scenario for New Delhi. The compounding stakes are terrifying.
Let's calculate the exposure. First, the human element. We have 9 million Indian citizens in the Gulf, roughly 800,000 in Kuwait and 400,000 in Bahrain. Their physical safety is at extreme risk.
And beyond the logistical nightmare of a potential maritime evacuation, there's the economic impact. The Gulf Remittance Corridor generates $40 to $45 billion annually for India. If that capital flow ceases, it devastates millions of dependent families in states like Kerala and UP.
Not to mention, India's strategy with the Chabahar port in Iran is completely paralyzed. But the apex threat, the shockwave that destabilizes the entire Indian macroeconomy, is energy dependency. India imports 85% of its crude oil.
And the market mechanics are ruthless. With the strait blockaded, global crude prices have spiked dangerously close to $100 a barrel. And that imported energy inflation lands directly on the balance sheets of Indian industries.
Which provides the perfect transition to the domestic fallout. This blockade is the exact reason the domestic aviation sector in India is on the verge of bankruptcy, and why the Union Cabinet just approved a massive bailout.
The aviation sector is the canary in the coal mine for oil shocks.
The numbers are unprecedented. Between March and May, aviation turbine fuel, ATF, surged 2.5 times, from roughly 60 rupees per liter to a crippling 142 rupees per liter.
It's a massive shock.
So to prevent systemic collapse, the cabinet approved a 10,000 crore rupee interest-free advance directly to the public sector oil marketing companies, like IOC and BPCL.
They've essentially created an ATF price stabilization fund.
I need to understand this mechanism. How does giving 10,000 crore to oil companies save the airlines?
It acts as a massive subsidy bridge. The government establishes a fixed benchmark price for ATF, say 80 rupees per liter. Even though the actual market cost to refine it is 142 rupees, the OMCs are instructed to sell it to the airlines at the capped 80 rupee rate.
Okay, so the airlines are shielded, but the OMCs are losing 62 rupees on every single liter they sell. That would instantly bankrupt them.
Precisely. That's where the 10,000 crore fund comes in. The OMCs draw that 62 rupee difference directly from the stabilization fund to cover their daily operational losses. The taxpayer is literally paying the difference to keep the planes flying.
But it's called an advance. How does the Consolidated Fund of India get its money back?
The gamble is that the geopolitical shock is temporary. If, in the next year or two, oil prices crash, and the actual cost of ATF drops below the benchmark, say it drops to 60 rupees, the mechanism reverses.
Oh, I get it. The OMCs keep selling it to the airlines at the artificially high 80 rupees, capture the 20 rupee profit margin, and funnel it back to the government to replenish the fund.
Exactly.
Okay, the mechanics make sense, but let me push back on the philosophy here. If we're a free market economy, why are we bailing out the airlines? If fuel costs go up 130%, shouldn't ticket prices go up 130%? If people can't afford it, they take the train. Why is the government socializing the losses of private companies with taxpayer money?
It's a valid free market critique,
Yeah.
but you have to look at the fragility of airline economics. Fuel is their single largest expense, typically 40% of operating costs. During a shock like this, it can exceed 60%. Profit margins are razor thin. If they pass that 130% increase to consumers, passenger demand wouldn't just drop, it would crater overnight.
So the airlines default on their leases and the sector collapses.
Yes, and the government cannot permit that because of domestic connectivity. A collapse would destroy the UDAN scheme, which subsidizes regional routes connecting Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities.
Ah, right.
Those routes already operate on a knife's edge. If fuel doubles, airlines immediately abandon regional routes, severing dozens of smaller cities from the national economic grid. The bailout is about preserving physical connectivity infrastructure.
But what if Iran permanently shuts the strait and oil stays at $100 for 5 years?
Then the recovery mechanism fails, and the 10,000 crore advance becomes unrecoverable sovereign debt, dragging down the fiscal deficit.
And the terror of that oil shock bleeds right into the broader macroeconomy, landing directly on the desk of RBI Governor Sanjay Malhotra. The Monetary Policy Committee is meeting right now, and they are in a nightmare scenario.
Absolute textbook stagflationary trap.
The repo rate is at 5.25%, but WPI inflation has surged to an 8.3% high, driven by the Hormuz blockade. Simultaneously, the Indian rupee plummeted to an all-time low of Rs 96.96 to the US dollar before stabilizing around 95.
You have massive imported inflation demanding higher interest rates, slowing domestic growth demanding lower rates, and a depreciating currency demanding capital controls. They're pulled in three directions at once.
The Indian Express analysis presents a counterintuitive theory about the undervalued rupee paradox. Everyone sees 95 rupees to a dollar and thinks the currency is collapsing. But macroeconomic analysts argue that if you look at the real effective exchange rate, the the rupee is actually overvalued. How is that possible?
It's a complex concept. The nominal rate, 95 to the dollar, is just the bilateral price tag. The rear measures the rupee against a weighted basket of currencies of India's major trading partners, and crucially adjusts for the differences in domestic inflation rates.
Okay, why does domestic inflation dictate the real value?
Purchasing power parity. Let's say an Indian and an American textile manufacturer produce an identical shipment of garments. If India has high domestic inflation, say 6% annually, while the U.S. has 2%, the Indian manufacturer's costs for electricity and labor rise much faster.
So the Indian garment becomes intrinsically more expensive to produce in rupee terms.
Right. If the nominal exchange rate remains flat, the Indian garment becomes vastly more expensive for a foreign buyer in dollar terms. India loses its export competitiveness.
Ah, So to maintain that competitive price advantage, despite high domestic inflation, the Indian rupee must depreciate against the dollar. The depreciation offsets the higher manufacturing costs.
Yes. The nominal depreciation is a natural shock absorber. Because India's inflation has been higher than its trading partners, the rupee should have weakened substantially more than it actually has. But the RBI has been intervening, selling foreign exchange reserves to artificially prop up the nominal value to prevent political panic.
So because they artificially prevented it from falling as far as it should have, the currency is, in real purchasing power terms, overvalued. An RER index value above 100 indicates overvaluation, and India's has persistently hovered above 105.
Exactly.
That's a brilliant explanation. So a nominal rate of 95 to the dollar might be the painful medicine the economy needs for exports. But financial markets are terrified. Foreign portfolio investors are pulling capital out at record velocities because the yield spread has collapsed.
Right. The U.S. Fed has kept rates elevated. The gap between a safe U.S. Treasury bond and a riskier Indian government bond has narrowed. Investors won't risk capital in a depreciating rupee for a marginal 7% return when they can get 5% in safe U.S. dollars.
The capital flight accelerates the decline, so the MPC is cornered. Let's debate their two primary options. Option one is a massive rate hike.
If they aggressively hike the repo rate, say by forecasted 50 basis points, it widens the interest rate gap. Indian bonds yield higher returns, attracting foreign capital back, stabilizing the rupee, and crushing demand to fight that 8.3% inflation.
But the collateral damage to the domestic economy would be catastrophic, right?
It would be. A 50 basis point hike makes capital violently expensive for Indian corporations. It dramatically increases EMIs for middle-class families with floating-rate home loans. It deliberately engineers a severe slowdown in domestic growth.
This is exactly what happened during the 2013 taper tantrum.
The parallels are chilling. In 2013, when foreign capital fled, the RBI, under Raghuram Rajan, deployed the orthodox defense. They hiked rates to choke off liquidity. It stopped the rupee's freefall. But the liquidity crunch devastated domestic corporate balance sheets and stalled growth for years. The current MPC is terrified of repeating that.
Which leads us to option two. If they refuse to hike domestic interest rates, they have to engineer a massive deposit drive targeting the diaspora to inject U.S. dollars into the system.
This is the high-stakes, unconventional playbook. The RBI authorizes Indian commercial banks to offer dramatically inflated interest rates, specifically on foreign currency. Non-repatriable, or FCNRB, dollar deposits targeting non-resident Indians.
They did this in 2013 too, didn't they?
Yes, and it was a massive success in acquiring capital. They raised $26 billion in just 60 days, stabilizing the currency without crushing domestic lending rates.
The intelligence suggests the RBI is targeting a massive $30 to $50 billion influx this time. It seems like the perfect asymmetrical solution. We defend the rupee, insulate the domestic economy, and leverage the diaspora. What's the catch? What is the systemic risk?
The risk is creating a massive, unhedged future sovereign liability. You are borrowing tens of billions of dollars today and contractually promising to pay them back, plus high interest in 3 to 5 years.
Oh, I see. What if the rupee continues to depreciate organically, say dropping to 110 to the dollar by the time those mature?
Then the cost of servicing that debt becomes astronomical. The RBI will have to purchase tens of billions of dollars on the open market at the heavily depreciated rate of 110 rupees to pay back the NRIs. The central bank absorbs the entirety of that massive exchange rate loss. It's a massive financial gamble.
It's staggering. A drone strike in the Strait of Hormuz directly forces the central bank in Mumbai to decide whether to engineer a domestic recession or mortgage the future balance sheet of the republic.
It really is fully interconnected. And unfortunately, the external shocks don't end there.
No, they don't. While India is dealing with global energy disruptions, it's simultaneously facing a deliberate economic assault from its most vital strategic partner, the United States. Let's look at the weaponization of trade.
The trade posturing from Washington right now is a masterclass in coercive economic diplomacy.
The USTR, Jameson Greer, has officially proposed a massive 12.5% retaliatory tariff on Indian exports under Section 301. But the justification is bizarre. The U.S. is not alleging that Indian manufacturers are using forced labor in their domestic factories.
No, they're weaponizing their domestic legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA. It establishes a rebuttable presumption that any goods produced wholly or in part in China's Xinjiang region involve forced labor and are prohibited from entering the U.S.
Okay, but how does that entangle India? The U.S. is proposing tariffs on India because Indian manufacturers import raw materials like cotton yarn or solar polysilicon from Xinjiang, process them in India, and export the finished goods to the U.S. The U.S. is demanding that India universally enforce the American UFLPA mandate across India's entire global supply chain.
Exactly. Washington is attempting to deputize the Indian government to enforce American human rights sanctions against a third sovereign nation.
I have to push back on the legality of this.
Yeah.
The U.S. is acting as a global HR department fining India because an Indian factory's raw material supplier might be violating an internal American statute that India never signed. That's an insane legal stretch.
It is a massive assertion of extraterritoriality. India's official stance is that its bilateral trade with China is a sovereign decision dictated by its own economic needs, not Washington's foreign policy.
Plus, using Section 301 for this seems totally misapplied. The Global Trade Research Initiative pointed out that Section 301 was designed for when American firms face discriminatory practices within a foreign country's market. Using it to police India's import strategy from a third nation is a flagrant violation of WTO norms.
The GTRI analysis is legally sound, but it ignores the real politic. Washington knows the legal basis is vulnerable at the WTO. The human rights angle is just a convenient pretext.
So this is a carrot and stick strategy. The U.S. is desperate to lock India into a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement, and they are methodically stacking punitive tariffs to create unbearable economic pain, forcing India to concede.
Let's break down this tariff stack because it is designed to obliterate Indian export competitiveness.
Let's trace the math. The foundation is the base MFN, most favored nation, tariff, the standard WTO rate averaging roughly 3.5%.
Which is easily absorbed.
Then the carrot. In February 2026, an interim deal lowered a swath of reciprocal tariffs down to a standardized 18%.
So we're operating at 3.5% plus 18%, which is 21.5%. Painful, but potentially manageable for high-value goods.
But then the U.S. deployed the first massive stick. In August 2025, the U.S. slapped an additional 25% penalty tariff on Indian exports, specifically because India continued to purchase heavily discounted Russian-Ural crude oil.
So add 25% to the 21.5% base, we're at 46.5%. At this level, vast sectors of Indian manufacturing are priced out of the American market.
And now, the proposed 12.5% forced labor tariff on top of that.
3.5 plus 18 plus 25 plus 12.5, the result is an insurmountable 59% effective tariff on Indian goods entering the United States.
A 59% tariff is basically a de facto embargo. The textile and ready-made garment industry is incredibly vulnerable here. The U.S. is our largest export market for apparel, an $8 billion trade flow. It operates on razor-thin margins.
If a 59% tariff hits, the Indian textile export sector collapses overnight. Global buyers will instantly shift to Bangladesh or Vietnam. We're looking at the catastrophic loss of millions of blue-collar manufacturing jobs.
And the irony is the generic pharmaceutical industry. India is the pharmacy of the world. The U.S. relies on affordable Indian generic drugs. A 59% tariff on Indian APIs would immediately spike healthcare costs for American consumers.
Which illustrates that this is a game of geopolitical chicken. The U.S. is inflicting maximum pressure before a specific deadline. On July 24, 2026, the temporary Section 122 tariffs legally expire. Washington is using the threat of the 59% stack to force India into a comprehensive deal before that date.
So what are the U.S. demands?
Washington wants unfettered, zero-tariff access for subsidized American agricultural and dairy products into the Indian market.
Which is political suicide for any Indian government. The Indian dairy sector is tens of millions of smallholder cooperative farmers. Cheap American dairy would destroy them.
Furthermore, U.S. tech conglomerates want India to dismantle its data localization laws. And on a geopolitical level, the U.S. is demanding India formally decouple its supply chains from China and sever its strategic relationship with Russia.
The demands are maximalist, but India possesses massive counter-leverage, right?
Absolutely. The U.S. desperately needs a strong India as a democratic counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific. They need India in the Quad, and as the anchor for the IM-6 corridor, the alternative to China's Belt and Road.
Not to mention, Silicon Valley relies heavily on Indian STEM talent via H-1B visas, and American corporations need access to the 1.4 billion-person Indian market.
So we have a standoff. The GCRI advocates filing a formal dispute at the WTO because the 59% tariff violently exceeds bound tariff rates.
But the WTO strategy is flawed by time, right? A dispute settlement takes years, especially since the U.S. has blocked appointing new judges. The Indian textile manufacturer facing bankruptcy next month can't wait 3 years for a ruling from Geneva.
Which is why backdoor negotiations are actively occurring. India is trying to execute a diplomatic tightrope walk. offering minor tech or manufacturing concessions to placate Washington and dismantle the 59% tariff, while fiercely protecting its dairy farmers and its strategic autonomy with Moscow and Beijing.
It is three-dimensional, high-stakes geopolitical poker. Okay, we have dedicated the vast majority of this deep dive to analyzing incredibly complex crises entirely manufactured by human systems. Let's finish with a profound systemic problem that nature created, which scientific architecture has finally miraculously begun to solve. Let's talk about the daraxonrasib medical breakthrough.
This is genuinely one of the most remarkable paradigm-shifting moments in the history of modern oncology.
The news breaking out of the ASCO 2026 meeting is just electric. Dr. Brian Wolpin presented the Phase 3 clinical trial results for daraxonrasib, a daily oral pill developed by Revolution Medicines for metastatic pancreatic cancer. And he received a massive, sustained standing ovation from thousands of the world's elite oncologists.
And oncologists are deeply skeptical. They don't give standing ovations lightly. To comprehend this, you have to understand the sheer brutality of pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, or PDAC.
Right. It's the third leading cause of all cancer-related deaths in the U.S. For a patient with metastatic PDAC, the 5-year survival rate is roughly 3%.
It has historically been an immediate death sentence. The standard of care is agonizing, highly toxic second-line chemotherapy, and the absolute best outcome it produces is a median overall survival of a mere 6 to 7 months.
Why has this specific cancer defied all our technology for half a century? We mapped the human genome decades ago.
It's a lethal combination of gross anatomy and hypercomplex cellular biology. Anatomically, the pancreas is a soft gland buried deep within the abdomen. There are no routine, non-invasive screening protocols. The tumor grows silently. Over 80% of cases are diagnosed at an advanced, inoperable stage.
But the real villain is the underlying molecular biology. Over 90% of all PDACs are driven by a specific mutation in the KRAS oncogene, the death star of cancer mutations.
Exactly. The KRAS gene contains the blueprint to manufacture a protein that acts as a master molecular switch. In a healthy cell, when the body needs to heal a wound, the KRAS protein binds to a molecule called GTP, toggles to the on-end state, and signals the cell to replicate. Once done, it toggles back FF.
But when it mutates, the blueprint is corrupted.
Yes. A single-point mutation jams the switch permanently in the on-end state. It relentlessly fires replication signals, rapidly building a massive, aggressive, malignant tumor.
Conceptually, it seems simple. Just engineer a drug to target that protein and shut it off.
But for 40 years, the mutant KRAS protein was considered chemically undruggable. Traditional targeted cancer drugs work by physically binding to a deep crevice or pocket on the surface of a protein.
Like a key in a lock.
Right. But the surface of the active KRAS protein is incredibly smooth and spherical. Imagine trying to get a grappling hook to catch onto a polished, rapidly spinning bowling ball. Every attempt failed.
So how does daraxonrasib crack the code?
It's a staggering leap in structural biology. Daraxonrasib is a multi-selective RAS-on inhibitor. It doesn't just look for a pocket. It acts as a sophisticated molecular wedge. It's engineered to bind tightly to the KRAS protein complex while it's actively bound to GTP in its on state, regardless of the specific underlying mutation.
It physically locks the active protein complex into a rigid conformation, cutting the transmission cable while the engine is screaming at maximum RPM.
Exactly. And the clinical data from the Phase 3 RSolute 302 trial is unequivocal. It literally doubled the median overall survival time compared to standard chemotherapy, from 6.7 months to 13.2 months.
When the hazard ratio was 0.40, right? That's a massive 60% reduction in the risk of death.
It's unprecedented. The FDA has fast-tracked its regulatory approval.
It is a medical miracle. And there's always a but. When we talk about global systems, what does this mean for a patient in India? Revolution Medicines spent billions on R&D. When daraxonrasib hits the market, it's going to be astronomically expensive, tens of thousands of dollars per month, and India has 10,000 to 12,000 new cases annually.
This is where the narrative loops violently back upon itself.
Yeah.
A miraculous cure is useless if the pricing model denies access. To make it accessible, the Indian government will likely have to deploy the most aggressive legal tool in international intellectual property: compulsory licensing under Section 84 of the Indian Patents Act.
Utilizing TRIPS flexibilities, like the sorafenib precedent in 2012.
Exactly. In 2012, Bayer priced the cancer drug sorafenib at over 2.8 lakh rupees a month. The Indian government granted a compulsory license to Natco Pharma, arguing the drug wasn't reasonably accessible, creating a public health emergency.
So they legally forced Bayer to license the patent to an Indian generic manufacturer who sold it for roughly 8,800 rupees a month. It saved thousands of lives.
But triggered an absolute firestorm from the Western pharmaceutical lobby. And we are hurtling towards that exact scenario with tariffs on receipt.
And we have to synthesize this with the geopolitics of segment 4. We are locked in an escalating trade war with the U.S. Washington is threatening a 59% tariff stack, and one of their core demands is for India to adopt TRIPS Plus's standards and abandon compulsory licensing.
The interconnectivity is breathtaking. The U.S. government is fiercely protecting the intellectual property of American biotech firms. The Indian government is fiercely determined to save the lives of its citizens. The escalating trade war over tariffs and the search for a medical miracle are on a direct collision course.
The ability of the Indian state to provide this oncological cure depends entirely on the diplomatic leverage it can wield in a bruising trade negotiation over import tariffs. Wow, what a monumental, heavy digest today has been. We started with the physical structural failures in South Delhi, where medical tourism collided with systemic gaps in municipal fire safety. We examined the massive digital hurdles subverting the 2027 census and how database glitches threaten the high-stakes math of national delimitation and caste politics.
We navigated the right to be forgotten at the Supreme Court, debating individual digital privacy versus public institutional memory.
We traced how Iranian drones in the Strait of Hormuz directly dictate the price of jet fuel in Mumbai, forcing a 10,000 crore bailout and cornering the RBI into a dilemma between a recession or a massive NRI deposit drive. We dissected the U.S.'s coercive 59% tariff stack on Indian exports. And finally, we found hope in daraxonrasib, a biomedical triumph for pancreatic cancer, only to realize that accessing it relies on those very same ruthless trade wars.
It perfectly illustrates our thesis. No system exists in isolation. We are navigating a fully integrated, hyper-fragile global matrix.
Before we sign off, what is the final overarching question for our listeners to ponder this week?
I want to connect the philosophical debate of the right to be forgotten with the scientific triumph of daraxonrasib. Biotechnology leaps of that magnitude are only possible because artificial intelligence can train its predictive models on massive, globally shared pools of historical patient records and genomic data.
Right.
So as we transition into an era of personalized, data-driven medicine, what happens when our individualistic desire for absolute digital privacy collides with our collective desire for medical miracles? If we all successfully exercise our right to be forgotten, redact our medical histories, and lock away our genetic data, will we inadvertently starve the very research models of the massive data sets they desperately require? In our rush to erase our digital footprints, will the absolute enforcement of the right to be forgotten ultimately cost humanity the cure for the diseases of tomorrow?
That is a chilling and deeply uncomfortable tension. A huge, profound thank you to you for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive into the 3D initiative. We hope this rigorous analysis helped you untangle the superficial headlines and expose the massive, interconnected architecture operating beneath the surface of today's digest. Stay curious, never stop rigorously questioning the stability of the systems operating around you, and we will catch you on the next one.